Hello and welcome to PolyCosm. My name is Christina and we are finally doing part 2 of a side quest video we actually released a little while ago. If you have no idea what the heck I'm talking about, Omercan actually made a video talking about how to approach insect designs and how he developed this concept, which in today's video we'll be bringing to life and creating a physics-generated insect swarm. Alright, let's get to it. So since I'll be using shape keys to animate the insect, I decided to go for a low poly approach. The reason is when you're using shape keys, if a model is incredibly polygon dense, manipulating the mesh through shape keys just becomes a much more difficult task. If you're unfamiliar with shape keys, I'll let past Christina explain. If I construct a cube, I can choose to make this the default state. But if I add in another key after the first one, move a vertice in a particular axis and enter object mode, it seems like nothing has happened. But if we increase the value, So let's try to hide the first key and let's create a second one. This time I want to squish the cube a bit from the top, so it'll look something like this. What if I now turn on the previous key? Voila! You see that we get a combination of both of these deformations, and we can of course manually adjust how much we want of each key. Hopefully you guys understand now. So normally when doing an insect design, I would use sculpting and then create a lower poly version, then project that high poly onto the low poly version to preserve details and so on. But even then, I think the lower poly version would probably be a bit too high. Maybe not in terms of polygon distribution, but because we'll later use Blender particles to simulate a swarm. And if you've never done particle simulations, they can be quite heavy on the system, especially when you're spawning loads of insects. So the lower poly you can keep the model, the better, in my opinion. And since we won't really be seeing the insects up really close, there's no need for sculpting and just adding tons of details you won't really be seeing. Instead, that detail would ideally come from the textures. Let's look at this example. Doesn't it look super detailed and intricate? Well, if I actually turn off the textures and only look at the wireframe model, look at just how simple the base mesh is. So this is kind of the approach I want to take instead. Although I don't really do any texturing during this video, but I mean if you want to see me texture the insect, let me know in the comments and maybe I'll make a part 3. Okay, I've been rambling for way too long. As you've been seeing, this approach I took for this model was pretty simple. If you're familiar with our content, you'll know that I love using the skin modifier to block out organic shapes. And in short, you just have to Shift A, add in a mesh and just go down to single vertice, add that single vertice. And then under the modifiers panel, just add a skin modifier and a subdivision modifier. I mean, you might not be able to see the vertice now, but if you go into Alt-Z, this is kind of like an X-ray mode, and you choose the vertices selection here, and if you just select that vertice and press E, you can start extruding. So you can just keep extruding, and you can also scale them up and down. And this is usually how I just block out very organic forms. It's just such an easy way to kind of edit the silhouette very quickly. But yeah, since Omercan so kindly provided me with orthographic views, I just use those to kind of guide the silhouette of my design. Once I'm happy with the shape, I just started shaping out other parts of the body. In the end, I ended up with a lot of separate elements like the legs, wings, and so on, but in the end I just joined all of these together. The reason is, when I'm using shape keys, I want it to be easier to pick the parts I want to move without it kind of being merged with the rest of the body. And as you saw previously, for the wings, I basically just used a plane that I conformed to the shape of the wings, and I also used a mirror modifier. Now, the mirror modifier really confused me when I first started using it. The key is to not move the mesh and the origin point when moving it around or scaling the mesh. Instead, move the mesh in edit mode. That way the origin point always stays in the middle when you exit edit mode. I basically used the mirror modifier on all of the legs, wings, and even the head at some point. The skin modifier came in really handy for the legs and arms. The modifier is just so much easier to control compared to if I were to use, for example, a cylinder and extrude, or a cube with a subdivision modifier thrown on top. Just take note of how quickly I can manipulate the silhouette of the limbs. And if you ever need more vertices to manipulate, you can just right click between two vertices you've selected and hit subdivide. I'll let the time lapse play for a little while to give you guys a break from all of my yapping. I'll catch you in a bit. And I'm back! I did use a bit of sculpting, but I didn't add any more geometry and only used the snake hook and crease/smooth brush to make the head conform to the concept a bit better. Again, we won't really be seeing the insect up close like this, so I didn't spend too much time at this stage. You don't really have much flexibility when the mesh is this low poly, so ideally the detail would come from the texture. I'm not the best texture artist, but I mean, if you guys want me to do a sort of bonus video explaining that, I'd be happy to make one. The spikes were basically just extruded planes, which I rotated using proportional editing. To enable proportional editing, just press this button, or the keyboard shortcut O. Instead of trying to extrude spikes from the arm mesh itself, I chose to use a separate mesh for convenience's sake. That way I could just duplicate the spikes and size them down for other parts of the arm. And for the shell on the back and the spiky bits there, I basically just selected the back and extruded the faces along their normals. And from there I extruded a bit more to get those spiky bits. Omercan's side view sketch really came in handy here. The ridges were basically created by applying edge loops and scaling them down. For some reason, this is really satisfying to look at when sped up, but it was so tedious when I was doing it in real time. And now for the fun part you've all been waiting for, which is animating with shape keys. Before doing anything, I had to select all the parts of the mesh and join them with Ctrl J. Then I created a basis shape key, which is the original state of the mesh, and the first animation layer, which will control the flaps of the upper wings. To get a better idea of how insects move, I actually looked at some slow motion footage of insects taking flight. And oh my god, they are so cute! Check this out. Whee! Look at how they lift their arms when flying. It's so freaking cute. Alright, serious face. So I used those references to basically guide the flap of the wings, and I just rotated the wings using the placement of the 3D cursor and made sure the X symmetry was turned on. You basically just move the wings where you want them to end in edit mode, and back in object mode, you can move the value up and down to make them flap. You can also adjust the maximum and minimum range to make the wings go further up and down if you wish. Other parts I animated were the back wings, of course, the tail going up and down, the pincers going in and out, and the arms bending outwards and going up and down. If you want to check out these animations, I'll link the work file in the pinned comments and description below. That will also include the swarm in the end, so you can play around with that if you so wish. So what do we do with all of these animations? I mean, they're great and all, but we need to kind of combine these somehow. Well, the great thing about shape keys is that you can actually keyframe them. So in the timeline, you can keyframe one state, go further down the timeline, keyframe another state, and then another state. And if you now go to the graph editor, select your keyframes and hit Shift E and make cyclic, you can actually create a loop animation. We basically need to repeat this for all of the different animation layers, and in the end you get something like this. Now this looks very silly since it's static, but once we put them in a physics simulated swarm, trust me, it'll look a lot better. And speaking of swarms, let's do that right now. You can make anything an emitter, which is basically the source objects the swarm will come out of, but I learned from Ian Hubert that an oval object like this has faces going in all directions, and if you choose to spawn the insects based on the directions of the faces, it can actually be a really good way of spreading them out once they get spawned. So while choosing that object, go to Particle Properties tab and add a particle system slot. Choose the amount of insects you want to spawn, and under Physics, choose Voids. And under Render, choose Render as Collection. You need to make sure that your insect is in a collection, and you just basically choose that one. Here you can also choose the size in which they appear on screen. Settings that are important is the mass of the object, which is basically how heavy it is when it's like flying around, and the movement, which basically lets you choose the speed, personal space, acceleration, and so on. Another important area is the void brain, which basically controls their behavior. The higher up in the hierarchy, the more important the rule is. Ian Hubert taught me an awesome trick where you can basically create an empty and have that act as a goal. You just link it under object. So looking at the hierarchy, they first try to separate, then go for the goal and flock around the goal. Once you're happy with the animation, you can choose to bake it under cache. And that's basically what you need to do. I spent ages tweaking these parameters and landed on something I think is a good middle ground. Since I want these insects to be fairly big in real life, I didn't want to really spawn thousands, and I also made sure they looked heavy by making them move a bit slower. Also, I can't be the only one who hears the Flight of the Bumblebee song when looking at this. I mean... Alright, that is honestly pretty much it. Since these bugs are untextured, I don't want to spend time making a nice render, adding in lighting, and so on. Again, let me know if you want that kind of video. Otherwise, feel free to play with the file linked in the pinned comment or description below. Have fun. Bye!